Story 1. My father died 4 weeks shy of his 100th birthday. He was 99 years and 337 days old. Only the last 4 months were bad because his body simply wore out. His mind never did. Story 2. My great-grandmother was emailing me in the last months before she died. She was born in 1891. Story 3. My great-uncle lived to 101. But because he was born on February 29th, I teased him that he was only 25. Story 4. She was born in 1908 and lived through 19 United States presidents. Story 5. I had a great-great-grandmother who lived to be over 110 years old. I do not know her exact age, but she was the oldest living person in our county at that time. I hope that I am blessed with a long, fruitful life like hers. Story 6. My mother is 87 and still living. She is the oldest member of my family. Story 7. In the last 200 years across 7 generations of my maternal line, 62. Story 8. My great-great-grandmother on my mom's side lived in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s. Story 9. He was 110, but he is Somali, so his exact age is uncertain. He was definitely over 105. Story 10. My family tends not to live very long. I only know 2 who reached their 80s. The men generally did not live past 60, while the women average around 70. Story 11. My mother is currently 93. I think she is the winner in our family. Story 12. Paternal grandmother, 91 years old. Story 13. My paternal grandmother was 90 when she died. She was the youngest of 5 siblings. Her 4 older siblings were still alive and over 100. Story 14. She lived to be 111, my great-grandmother. She was born in 1888 and passed away in 1999. A few days before New Year's. She had dementia for the last decade and a half. Most people in my family live well into their 90s on both sides. I thought that was cool growing up, but not so much anymore. Story 15. I am not sure, but my father may be in the lead at 85. Heart attacks and strokes tend to claim family members by age 80. That is if they avoid cancer, which has claimed family members in their mid-70s. Dad recently survived prostate cancer. It was caught early, and it is one of the most treatable forms of cancer. Story 16. My maternal grandparents died at 99 and 101 years old. They passed within 8 hours of each other. I told my mother when they were in their early 80s that they would die in each other's arms. I was not far off. Story 17. Not a family member, but I used to work in a nursing home and we had a woman who lived to be 105 or 106. Story 18. My grandfather was 104 when I met him. He refused to grow older. All his subsequent birthdays remained 104. Story 19. My great-grandmother is over 90. Most people in my family live into their late 80s. I figure I have about 10 to 12 years. Story 20. My great-great-grandmother lived to 115. Fabulous Cypriot genes. Many long-lived relatives in the family. Lucky me in this economy. Story 21. My great-grandmother was 93 when she fell down the stairs and died. The oldest living family member now is my dad, who turned 73 yesterday. Story 22. A family member on my mother's side lived to about 86, I think. Story 23. 102. We think she stuck around waiting for her Canadian Football League team to win again. Story 24. I decided a long time ago that I am going to live forever or die trying. Story 25. My great-grandmother died at 93. She raised her children and my mother. She was my grandmother. I was 30 when she passed. Story 26. My great-grandmother lived to 92. That is the longest living family member I am aware of. Story 27. My dad is 91 and counting. He is the oldest person in my family so far. Story 28. My great-great-grandfather lived to 96. Cause of death. He was shot and then publicly hanged. Story 29. The evil woman moved to South Africa in the 1970s so she could own slaves again. Story 30. My uncle, my father's younger brother, lived to be 97. My mother died a month before she would have turned 96. Story 31. My uncle is 99 and stopped driving earlier this year. His 100th birthday party is in 3 months. I expect him to reach at least 102 years. More is possible. He has already exceeded his father's age by 8 years, and is much healthier than his father was during his last 10 years. His father died in the 1970s. Story 32. My grandmother lived to 102 and was still baking pies for the holidays. Story 33. My grandmother is 98 and a half, but I spoke to someone this weekend whose mother is 108. Story 34. This was my grandfather on my father's side, who lived to 104. He was rarely sober, smoked like a chimney, and once pointed a gun at my brother for no good reason. Sanity and clean living are obviously not requirements to live to a very old age. Malicious stubbornness is good enough. Story 35. My great-grandmother is 109. Longevity is common among the women in my family. I certainly hope that changes. That side of the family is also very well off. Story 36. My aunt, who never drove, never had children, and never experienced stress, is 98 and a half years old. She has dementia but no other health issues. It is remarkable that she seems to have always had some form of mental illness, yet her body keeps going. Story 37. My maternal great-aunt lived to 100 years and was just shy of 3 months. She was an amazing woman who remained mentally sharp until the very end. Story 38. 90-something, I believe. Most of my older generation died from work-related or poverty-related conditions. Story 39. My mother is 92 years and 4 months old. Her mother, my grandmother, died at age 87. I am 70 and hoping I have inherited their longevity genes. Story 40. 98. It was either my grandmother or my grandfather, but I do not remember them well. Story 41. My mother died last year at 93. She was pretty clear until the end. Story 42. My grandfather lived to 101. My great-grandmother lived to at least 99 and possibly longer. My grandmother lived to 99. If cancer does not get me first, I have a good chance of living a long life. Story 43. My great-aunt is 102 and still walking and talking. Most members on that side live into their 90s unless they develop cancer. On the other side of the family, the women tend to live into their 90s while the men do not. Story 44. 3 people made it to their 80s as far as I can remember. If we make it to our 70s, we usually do not make it to our 80s. Story 45. My maternal grandmother lived to 102. My father is still kicking at 87 and turns 88 in November. He just returned from a short grocery trip that he drove. It is 4 blocks away. I like him to have some independence. It is a balancing act. He is still sharp and spry. Story 46. Husband's great-aunt turned 107 last month but has very little quality of life. On the other side of his family, his grandmother almost lived to 102. Story 47. On my father's side, my great-aunt lived to 101. Her fraternal twin, my grandmother, died at 63. Another sister and one of the brothers lived into their late 90s. Story 48. My great-aunt is 106. I have a picture of my second great-grandmother, who was born in 1838 and died in 1928. Story 49. My dad passed away in 2021. He is the oldest on both his paternal and maternal sides as far as I know. Story 50. Great-grandmother was 102 when she died in the late 1990s. Story 51. As far as I know, she was 99. I know she was upset she did not make it to 100. Loved you, Aunt Dode. Story 52. My father lived to 79 and was the oldest male in his maternal line as far back as I have been able to trace, but I do not know much about that branch. My mother lived to 90, older than either of her parents. Given my health problems, I do not expect to live 2 more years to reach 70. Story 53. My uncle once told me that anything past 75 means you are living on borrowed time. He lived to 98. Story 54. My great-granduncle lived to be well over 100. Story 55. To my knowledge, my great-grandmother on my mother's side lived to 88. My grandfather on my father's side wasn't far behind. He died 12 days after his 87th birthday. Story 56. My grandmother is 95 years old and still alive. My grandfather lived to 93. He passed away a few years ago. Story 57. I had a great aunt who lived to 96, and I currently have another who is 95 and still doing well. Story 58. My great-grandmother lived to about 86. Considering she chain-smoked cigarettes every day from about age 13, that is quite impressive. She believed the secret was putting honey in her tea instead of sugar. Story 59. My great-grandmother passed away 1 month before her 99th birthday. My grandmother celebrated her 98th birthday and remains in excellent health. Story 60. Both of my great-grandmothers lived past 100. One reached 104, the other 103. Both of my grandmothers lived into their late 90s. Story 61. We have had a couple of people live to 100 or more. They were great aunts. Men usually live into their mid-80s. Women usually live into their mid-90s. Story 62. My mom is 76. The average age at death of my parents and grandparents is 60. My mom raised the average. Story 63. My aunt just turned 100, I believe. My mother is almost 92. Story 64. Of my 4 grandparents, 3 lived past 95. My grandmother is 99 and still lives in her own apartment. Her husband died at 97, and my paternal grandmother lived to 96. I do not remember my paternal grandfather. He died when I was 2 at the age of 69. Story 65. A few reached 103, several reached 101, and the average was between 94 and 97. Story 66. Grandma passed away 2 years ago. She was 99. One of her sisters is still alive, and I think she is 102 or 103. Story 67. My mother was just shy of 96. One of my father's sisters lived to be 103, and another was almost 101 when she passed. Story 68. Currently my mother is 87. She lived through a war when she was a child. My grandparents died at 82. Story 69. My maternal grandfather died at the age of 101. He choked on scrambled eggs and might have lived a few years longer if that had not happened. Story 70. My dad will turn 79 in November. He is the oldest in the family so far. Story 71. My great-great-grandmother lived to be 100, from 1870 to 1970. At her 100th birthday party, she asked how old she was. When told, "You are turning 100," she said, "Oh, that is too old," and died 3 weeks later. Story 72. My great-grandmother died at 103. She was born in the 19th century, lived through the entire 20th century, and died in the 21st century. Story 73. My great-grandmother lived to 104. That line of the family was long-lived, except for my mother, whose bitterness led to an all-too-early death. Story 74. According to my research, she was 102 years old. I do not really know much about her. She was my father's great-aunt, and no one else in his family lives past 65, so there is no one around to tell me about her. Story 75. My great-aunt lived to 100. My dad, on the same side of the family, is 90. Story 76. My great-grandmother, who was 105, passed away in 2005. She used to tell people she was born in 1900. Story 77. She was 97 and often said how miserable it was to be that old and lose all of her loved ones. She was an amazing woman, but she became very sad as she grew older. Story 78. My family members generally pass away in their mid-80s. My spouse's family members either pass away young or nearly reach 100. Story 79. Mother and grandmother both made it to within a few months of 100. Story 80. I had a great-aunt who died at 103. My great-grandmother was born in 1900 and died in 2001. Her mind was sharp as a tack until the last few months. Story 81. My paternal grandmother died at 95. My maternal grandmother is currently 94. One aunt on my maternal side lived to be 104, and I never met her. Story 82. My great-grandfather lived to 99 and would have easily reached 100 if he had not been hit by a car while getting the mail. My father is 85 and is the longest living person with his last name, going back at least to the mid-1800s. Story 83. My husband's great-grandmother lived to 107. The oldest living member of my family is 87, the oldest age any of us have reached. Story 84. She lived to 98, but she was a major anomaly. Most of my family died before 70. Story 85. 102. She was upset when she had to give up her aerobics class at 96. Story 86. I knew 3 of my great-grandparents. They reached their late 90s. 3 of my grandparents died in their 80s, and 1 is still alive at 96. Both my parents are alive and in their 60s. It seems family members tend to live long, but as far as I know, no one has reached 100. I hope my grandmother makes it. She has 4 years to go, but I am worried for her. Mentally, she remains surprisingly sharp, but she is becoming very frail. Story 87. My dad died in his sleep at home the day before his 97th birthday. His youngest sister just turned 105 and is doing very well for that age. Story 88. She lived to 101, I believe. She was my paternal great-aunt. My maternal great-grandmother died at 94. Story 89. My great-grandmother died earlier this year at 102. She could still have been alive if she had wanted to. She had fluid in her lungs. Doctors could have easily fixed it, but she declined treatment. She still lived on her own without assistance and was sharp as a tack. An amazing woman. Story 90. The oldest family member I am aware of is 92, but my oldest patient was 108. Story 91. My great-grandmother lived to 91. If we dig deeper into my family history, one ancestor supposedly lived to 109, although I doubt it is true because the claim dates from the 18th century. Story 92. Both of my biological parents are 88 years old, active and mentally sharp. Story 93. Paternal grandfather. He was born in 1840 and died in 1939 at the age of 99, while my father was in college. My father later lived to age 95. Story 94. Great-grandmother lived to just shy of 102. Her brother reached 106 or 107, and 2 of their children recently passed the century mark. By comparison, my grandparents died relatively young at 92. Call your Grammy and Grampy or whatever you call them, even if it is just to say something small. You only have them for so long, and you will forget what their voice sounded like unless you hold on to it. Story 95. My great-grandmother made it to 104. She drank coffee like water, swore at everyone, and somehow outlived 3 husbands. Story 96. My grandmother lived until she was 102, but she was quite miserable for the last 2 years. Story 97. My grandmother is 88. My wife's great-grandmother lived to 99. Story 98. I honestly do not know anyone in my lifetime who lived beyond their 80s. The men lived into their 70s. Story 99. I had a great-great-aunt I never met who lived to 104. She was born in the early 1900s. She was the eldest of 4 and the only girl. Their father died in the 1918 influenza pandemic, and she left school to help her mother care for the children. Her closest sibling, the eldest son, left school to work around age 12. Her mother lived into her 90s. Her brother, my great-grandfather, had a grandmother-in-law who lived to about 102. I never met any of them, but I have many photographs. Story 100. My great-aunt lived to 101. She was fully lucid when she died, miserable, smelled like urine, and always told me how she wanted to die. I hope I don't live that long. Story 101. My great-grandfather lived to be 99 years old and passed away in 2010. I met him twice. Story 102. My great-grandmother lived to be 99. None of the men made it nearly that far. I think my dad, at 77, might be next. Then again, both of my grandfathers died from smoking-related causes, so who knows how long they would have lived without that. Story 103. I had a great-grandmother who lived to 106. She was born in 1886 and died in 1992 when I was a teenager. Story 104. My dad was 88 when he passed. I thought that was amazing. He worked hard all his life and was a young teenager in Germany during World War II, which was a difficult time. Story 105. My granny holds the current record at 85 years and 51 weeks. Edited to add, she almost died when she was 59 and a half. The surgeon would not have operated if she had been 60. Story 106. I moved back into my dad's house at age 31 while my house was being renovated. Story 107. Grandmother lived to 106 and passed 3 years ago. She was so angry about being the oldest of 12 siblings, having raised them, and about being the last one by far. Story 108. My maternal grandmother is 95. She is still alive, but she is sick, so she may not live much longer. Story 109. My great-aunt lived to 94, I believe. The others died either young or on a relatively normal timeline. Story 110. Dad passed away at 94 from lung cancer. He lived for 4 years after being diagnosed. He had not smoked for over 40 years, but the damage had been done. A person's immune system weakens with age, and it could not fight the cancer any longer. Story 111. My grandfather lived to 92, outliving everyone by about 20 years. My grandmother died at 86. Story 112. My grandmother died 3 days before her 80th birthday. She had a dizzy spell, fell in a casino parking lot, and hit her head. That was it. She was gone. There was a big party planned to celebrate her 80th birthday. Instead, we all came together for her funeral. I felt so bad for my dad. Story 113. My great-grandmother lived to 102. At 101, she became an American citizen. Story 114. My uncles Connor and Duncan are very old. Real interesting guys. One sounds like Stimpy from Ren and Stimpy. At my mom's birthday, I asked the uncles if they wanted cake. One replied, I want it all and I want it now. My dad said, that's a whole lot of cake. It's probably bad for your heart. Uncle Connor started singing, Who Wants to Live Forever? Then someone came in and said, You feel that, McLeod? That's the quickening. I have a weird family. Story 115. My paternal grandfather died at age 102. He remained fairly functional and present until about the last 3 years of his life. He began having many strokes. Unlike Johnny Rotten in the Neil Young song, he did not burn out but faded away. Story 116. My maternal grandparents are 85 and 93. My grandmother's parents lived to 82 and 79. My grandfather's parents lived to 87 and 77. My grandfather's sister is 95 and still living. Their other sister lived to 92. They had a younger brother who died of an illness at age 23 in 1951. My maternal great-grandfather, the one who died at 79, had an aunt who outlived him. She lived to 99 and died when I was 5 years old. Story 117. My maternal great-grandmother lived to 104. We called her Black Yaya because she only wore black after her husband died, about 50 years before I was born. She could not read, write, or speak English, and she could not read or write Greek except for the Bible, which she was always reading. Story 118. In my family, 87. In my husband's family, 103. Hoping the kids got dad's genes. Story 119. My great-grandfather lived to be 100. He was born in August 1904 and died in January 2005. Story 120. Both grandmothers lived to their mid-90s. I do not want to outlive my retirement savings, so I would prefer to pass away in my mid-80s. Story 121. My aunt is 100 years old, and she was very upset when the Queen died because everyone who reaches 100 receives a letter from the Crown. Aunt Marjorie did not want a letter from King Charles. She wanted a letter from Queen Elizabeth. Story 122. Grandpa and Grandma lived to 94. One of my wife's great aunts lived to 102 and a half. She lived alone after her husband died when she was 40. She fell and broke her hip. Once you stop moving. Story 123. My grandmother was 103 years old. She died in 2021. She was a very cool person. She had some gastrointestinal problems, so she frequently passed gas and not quietly. It was very loud, but I had been used to it for the last 15 years of her life. My mother explained it to me because my father would get mad at me when I passed gas. I asked, "Why does grandma get to pass gas whenever she wants?" My parents replied, "Because she is in her 90s. Story 124. My third great-grandmother was born in Kilkenny, Ireland, in 1797 and died in Brooklyn, New York, in 1897, a few months short of her 100th birthday. Story 125. My maternal grandparents are 95 and 89. My mother is 75. My paternal grandparents are 89 and 78. My father is 59. Considering the generational decline, this does not bode well for me. Story 126. If the records are correct, one of my ancestors in Ireland lived to 105. Story 127. My maternal great-great-grandmother lived to 94. She was spry and a savvy businesswoman until she was 92, when she began transferring properties to her son to avoid the estate tax. During the last 2 years of her life, she mostly sat in her recliner, sewing matching dresses for my Barbie doll and me and dress shirts for 2 baby cousins. She died shortly after I turned 9. Her daughter is still alive, as far as I know, but is extremely toxic, and I haven't spoken to her in more than 30 years. My grandmother died about 15 years ago from a stroke. Being 480 pounds and a chain smoker contributed to it. Story 128. My great-grandmother is 105 years old and still going strong. She did not use a wheelchair until last year. She said she is tired of walking all the time because she has been doing it for over 100 years. Story 129. My maternal grandmother was 97, and my mother, her daughter, was 92. Story 130. According to my grandmother, her grandfather lived to about 116 years old. Story 131. My 15th great-grandfather was 116 years old at the time of his death in the 1500s. Story 132. Many people in my family die very early. We are high achievers who are well educated, including doctors, lawyers, professors, and engineers, and I am a nurse practitioner. We experience a lot of stress, and almost all of my relatives have died from cancer. The oldest to reach 80 was my grandmother. She was a stay-at-home mother of 5, which is still a stressful job. Story 133. My grandfather on my mother's side passed away 2 months ago at the age of 94. Story 134. One of my uncles reached 91 and died in 1998. He was left-handed like me and made sure no one tried to make me right-handed. My mother had no intention of changing me, but he went to bat to make sure my father did not try. Story 135. My grandmother and 2 of her sisters all lived into their mid-90s. I think 98 was the oldest. Story 136. At 105, Grandma Jenkins was the oldest woman in Utah until her passing in 2015. Story 137. My grandmother was 96. She suffered a terrible stroke and had a difficult end of life. Poor woman. Story 138. Her youngest daughters, my grandmother and my great-aunt, are a week short of 93 and still alive. We will see how long they live. My grandparents on the other side have major health issues, so I am not sure they will make it to 80. Story 139. Great-grandmother Bailey, aged 103, was born in 1891 and died in 1994. She smoked for about 50 years. I was her favorite great-grandchild because I inherited her ginger hair. Story 140. My grandmother and her sisters are all in great health for their ages. My grandmother will be 92 this year. Her sisters are 95 and 98. My 98-year-old great-aunt truly looks like she could be the youngest. Story 141. My great-great-aunt Libby lived 5 months past her 100th birthday. She was a spitfire, to say the least. Story 142. 82, if I recall correctly. It's all right. I don't think my body is built to last much longer, anyway. Story 143. My father passed away 3 weeks before his 96th birthday. He was the oldest person ever in his family. On my mother's side, one aunt lived to be 85. Story 144. My great-great-grandfather on my maternal side was 105 when I was 5. My father is now 70 and his parents are both still alive in their 90s. Story 145. My paternal great-aunt lived to almost 103. My grandfather was her brother and lived until 101. My maternal great-grandmother lived to 102. I really hope I do not have to live that long. Story 146. I have one living grandparent, and he is well into his 90s. Story 147. 83. This was my nan on my mum's side. We die young in our family. Dad's father was 75. Dad's mother was 54. Dad was 49. Story 148. My paternal grandmother is 97 now. My maternal grandmother lived until 92. Story 149. My great-aunt is 103 and going strong. She had 14 children, and many of them still live with her. I like to think that part of the reason she is doing so well is that she is in a lively and loving home full of her children. Her brother, my grandfather, turns 98 this week. They also have a 101-year-old sister. Story 150. My grandmother, 3 of my aunts, and 1 uncle lived to be 98 or 99. Nobody has made it to 100 yet. Story 151. My great-great-grandfather lived to be 104 and spoke 7 languages. I never met him, but from my mother's stories he was a great man. Story 152. My mother is 90 years old and going strong. She has always said she will live to 100, and I would not bet against her. She is 90% of the way there. Mentally she is doing well. She has slowed down physically, but that has not stopped her. Story 153. My father is 96 and a half years old and has lived in the same home since 1975. He loves reading crime thrillers. He is slowing down but keeps going. Story 154. My great-grandmother died less than a year ago at 93. She had a wonderful relationship with my 8-year-old son, her great-great-grandchild. Sometimes that vast age gap can be scary for kids, and relationships like theirs seem rare. I'm grateful for it. The grandmother I was very close to died a couple of years after my son was born, and he missed the chance to know her. Her mother, my great-grandmother, stepped up, and it was a beautiful thing. My son has autism, and we have struggled to understand what death means since my great-grandmother passed away. He misses her, and so do I. The pure love between them was amazing. Story 155. My paternal grandmother is 93 and still smart as a whip and completely with it. She is amazing. Story 156. My grandfather's aunt passed away last year 3 days after her 99th birthday. Story 157. I have an aunt who is 102 and another who is 98. My grandfather lived to 101. My mother died young at 92. She smoked for decades and drank daily for even longer. Story 158. Maternal grandmother died at 93, and maternal grandfather died at 100. Paternal grandparents died in their 80s, and paternal great-grandparents lived past 100. Story 159. My maternal grandfather lived to be 92. My dad, age 74, is the oldest known male relative on his side of the family that we are aware of, going back to my great-grandparents' generation. There is a strong history of heart problems among the men in my family, and he has survived 3 major cardiac events himself, so I am doing everything I can to reduce my risk. Story 160. 96. I have had multiple people in my family live to that age, including my maternal grandfather. Story 161. I believe my great-grandmother was 97. She was the oldest by 20 years. Story 162. At 106 years old, she was in good health until her final year. She ate what she wanted, including ice cream, cake, and pie for breakfast, and generally did not take life too seriously. Story 163. My great-aunt lived to be 103. Of the 7 siblings, 5 lived to be over 90. My grandfather lived to be 85, and a sister died in her 40s. Story 164. I am the only known person in my family line, 45 years so far. Story 165. My great-grandmother died a few months before her 100th birthday. Story 166. I have a great-aunt who I think is 99. She is still alive, but she has wanted to die for about 20 years. Story 167. I am not sure, but my maternal grandmother is currently in her 90s. Story 168. Two great-great-grandmothers lived to 104 and 103. I knew both of them and their children, my great-grandparents. I have a photograph of me at 1 year old that shows 5 generations. Those great-great-grandmothers died when I was a teenager. Neither of my great-grandparents made it to 100 because of cancer, dementia, and coronavirus disease 2019. At least I still have grandparents in my 30s. Story 169. My grandfather's grandfather lived to 107. He was born in 1841 and died in 1948. Story 170. One of my great-grandparents reportedly lived to 101 years, but that is an extreme outlier. 40 to 80 years seems to be the average lifespan in my family. Story 171. My brother lived to age 66. I am 65. All my grandparents and parents had died by age 64. Story 172. My great-great-grandmother died at 97. I am only 25, and I have had a conversation with someone who was born before the Titanic sank. Story 173. My great-grandfather lived to 92, and my great-grandmother reached 94. Story 174. My great-grandpa was 97. He passed away about 5 years ago. My fan has a long lifespan, to be honest. Story 175. My great-great-grandfather came west by wagon in the late 1800s and bought a farm in Kansas. When he visited his old home as a much older man, he flew there on a jet airliner. He died in 1976, if I recall correctly. Story 176. My grandmother reached 94 when she passed away in August. Her mental faculties had declined, but she was ready to go. Story 177. The women on my mother's side live into their 90s. They are happy, carefree, and active. Then, one morning they say they are not feeling well. No pain or other symptoms, nothing alarming, just feeling out of sorts. Within 24 to 48 hours they pass away at home, peacefully in bed, in a lounger, or on the sofa. Story 178. I am not 100% sure, but I am not nearly as old as everyone else commenting here. I can think of several who were in their 80s, but I do not think any were older than that. Story 179. A great-aunt lived to 103. She was the sister of my mother's father. A great-uncle lived to 102. He was the brother of my mother's mother. Neither was married. My father died at 94 and my mother died at 86. Grandparents on both sides lived into their 80s or 90s. We live a long time, but we are all a little weird. Story 180. My great-grandmother was nearly 100. I would have to dig out her memorial program to know the exact age, because for some reason we celebrated her 90th birthday twice. I assume the reason is that my family and mathematics are not simpatico. Story 181. My great-grandmother passed away 2 months before her 100th birthday. Story 182. My father lived until 90. I do not want to be 90. I am 74 now. If I reach 80, I will feel like I have lived too long. The body breaks down over time, and I do not want to be an invalid or need help. I live alone, and I think I am doing pretty well, all things considered. Story 183. She is 105. She received a letter from the Queen of England when she turned 100, wishing her a happy birthday. Laughing out loud. Story 184. 99 and a half years old. I am pretty sure she died while they were planning her centennial. Story 185. To all of you whose parents lived so long, I'm glad they were able to enjoy a rich life surrounded by loving people like you. Story 186. My grandfather is 99 years old. We hope to celebrate his 100th birthday in a few months. Story 187. My 2 siblings and I are in our 70s or 80s. None of the three of us ever smoked. Our parents died in their 60s. They were lifelong smokers. Any questions? Story 188. My maternal grandmother was 97, the only close relative to ever reach 90. Story 189. Grandfathers lived to ages 76 and 86. One smoked unfiltered cigarettes. Grandmothers lived to ages 86 and 94. Father lived to age 90. Mother is 92 and independent. Story 190. My great-grandma lived to 105, 1 month shy of 106. She had a bear claw with dinner every night. Don't sass Grammy. She gets her pastry. Story 191. My grandmother was 91 and my grandfather was 88. They were born in 1916 and 1921. Story 192. My great-great-grandmother lived to 113. She was stubborn in a charming way, and I adored her. She refused to die until she appeared in the newspaper, and she died exactly 10 years after the article appeared. The article noted that there were 5 generations of women at the time. She always did what she wanted and what she believed was right, even when others disagreed. I do not think she was ever wrong. She was a force of nature. Story 193. My great-grandmother passed away at 95 about 2 weeks after her birthday party. She still lived alone and was sharp as a whip. The only sign of her age was being a bit weepy due to a stroke 40 years before she died. She also had to get a smaller cast iron skillet because she could no longer lift the larger one. She slipped and fractured her hip and never came out of sedation. Altogether, it was a rather peaceful passing. I firmly believe she would have reached 100 easily if not for the fall. Story 194. My maternal great-grandmother lived until her late 90s. Story 195. About 94, I believe. The rest range between 65 and 85. Mom was one of the older ones. She was 2 weeks shy of her 89th birthday. She had dementia. Story 196. My grandmother's sister lived to about 105. I never met her because everyone in the family hated her and described her as an evil person. Maybe that's the secret to longevity? Story 197. To the best of my knowledge, my grandmother lived until 85. I do not know the ages of many other relatives, such as great-grandparents. Story 198. My grandmother's first cousin lived to 103. Strangely, most of the women on my mother's side of the family died at age 90, including my mother. I guess it is good to know when you are going to go. Laughing out loud. Story 199. She outlived 3 husbands and 4 of her 6 children. She lived entirely on her own from her 70s until she turned 100 in a ridiculously cool old 3-story house and tended a 1-acre garden every year. 75% of what she ate was food she grew and preserved herself. When she decided she needed help, she moved into a small guest house in her granddaughter's backyard so she could keep her independence. I lost track of how many times we got the "okay, this is probably it" call, only for her to walk out of the hospital a few days later. Once, when she did not recover as quickly, they sent her home with end-of-life care. The home health team said she had hours, not days. She had not woken up for days. We were all gathered in the living room where she was resting in a hospital bed, waiting for her to pass, and she woke up, looked around the room and said, "You'd think with all of you here at least one of you could bring me a cup of coffee." Then she went on to live another 2 years. Story 200. My great-aunt was 104. She passed away in her sleep at the nursing home. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.